Marcus Street Williams sits in a small coffee shop in downtown Seattle, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup that's gone cold. At 58, he looks older than his years. The kind of aging that comes from living hard and carrying heavy secrets. For the first time in over 2 decades, he's ready to talk about the day he said no to one of rock music's most tortured souls. People think dealers don't have a conscience, Marcus says, his voice barely above a whisper. They think we're just predators who feed off people's weakness. But when you've been in the game as long as I was, you see things, you learn to read people, and sometimes you realize that making a sale might be the same as pulling a trigger. March 15th, 2002. That's the date burned into Marcus's memory, 3 weeks before Layne Staley's body would be discovered in his university district apartment. It was the day Marcus Williams, a man who had supplied drugs to half of Seattle's music scene for over a decade, looked into the eyes of Alice in Chains frontman and decided he couldn't be the one to sell him his final fix. To understand the significance of what happened that March day, you need to understand Marcus Williams and his role in Seattle's drug ecosystem during the grunge era. Born and raised in the Central District, Marcus got into dealing not out of malice, but out of necessity. My mom was working 3 jobs just to keep us in our apartment. Marcus recalls, I was 16, watching her kill herself for pennies while rich kids from the suburbs came to our neighborhood looking for drugs. I figured if they were going to buy anyway, might as well be from someone who needed the money. By the early 1990s, as Seattle's music scene exploded, Marcus had built a reputation as a reliable supplier who maintained strict rules about his business. No dealing to kids under 18, no selling to pregnant women, no fronting drugs to people who were clearly in over their heads. I had standards, Marcus insists. Sounds crazy, coming from a drug dealer, but I did. I wasn't trying to destroy lives. I was trying to survive in a world that didn't give people like me many options. Marcus's client list during the grunge boom read like a who's who of Seattle rock royalty. He won't name names. Some of them got clean, some of them are still alive, and they deserve their privacy. But he confirms that his customer base included members of several major bands. Seattle in the 90s was like this perfect storm, Marcus explains. You had all this creative energy, all this success happening really fast, and all this pressure. These musicians went from playing small clubs to selling millions of records overnight. A lot of them couldn't handle it. Marcus first encountered Layne Staley in 1991, shortly after Alice in Chains' debut album, Facelift, started gaining traction. He wasn't my customer initially, Marcus remembers. He came with someone else, I won't say who, and he was just observing, not participating. He seemed curious but scared, like he was standing at the edge of a cliff trying to decide whether to jump. Marcus's first direct sale to Layne came in early 1992, around the time Alice in Chains was recording Dirt, the album that would make them superstars and, according to Marcus, accelerate Layne's descent into addiction. He called me directly, which was unusual, Marcus recalls. Most people came through referrals through other people, but Layne just called and said he'd gotten my number from a mutual friend. He wanted to meet somewhere private. They arranged to meet at a parking garage in Capitol Hill. Marcus arrived to find Layne sitting in his car, visibly nervous. He was shaking, Marcus remembers. Not from withdrawal. He wasn't deep enough in it yet for that. He was shaking from fear, from the knowledge that he was about to cross a line he couldn't uncross. The transaction was small, just enough heroin for a few uses, what Marcus calls a tourist purchase. He paid cash, thanked me politely, and left, Marcus says. Very businesslike. But I could see in his eyes that he was already calculating when he'd need to call me again. Over the next few months, Layne's purchases became more frequent and larger. By late 1992, he was calling Marcus twice a week. The transformation was fast, Marcus observes. Faster than I'd seen in most people. Usually it takes months or years for someone to go from casual use to full dependency. With Layne, it was like watching someone fall off a cliff in slow motion. Marcus noticed other changes too. Layne's demeanor during transactions shifted from nervous to resigned to desperate. In the beginning, He'd make small talk, ask about my family, treat me like a person, Marcus recalls. As the addiction took hold, I became just a means to an end. He'd show up, make the purchase, and leave without saying much. That's when I knew he was in real trouble. By 1994, Marcus had become deeply concerned about Layne's escalating usage. The purchases were not only more frequent, but also more reckless. He started showing up at weird hours, 3 a.m., 6 a.m., Marcus says. That's usually a sign that someone's tolerance has gotten so high they can't make it through the night without using. When that happens, you know they're close to the point of no return. Marcus also noticed Layne's physical deterioration accelerating. Every time I saw him, he looked worse, Marcus recalls. Weight loss, pale skin, that hollow look in his eyes. But the scariest thing was that he stopped caring about his appearance entirely. When someone stops caring what they look like, it usually means they've stopped caring whether they live or die. After Kurt Cobain's suicide, in April 1994, Marcus says Layne's drug use became even more erratic and dangerous. Kurt's death broke something in Layne, Marcus observes. He called me the day after they found Kurt's body, and I could hear him crying on the phone. He said, "Street, what if Kurt was right? What if this is all there is?" I didn't know what to say to that. Layne's purchases in the weeks following Cobain's death were the largest Marcus had ever sold to him. He bought enough to kill himself 10 times over, Marcus admits. I almost didn't sell it to him. But he begged me, said he wasn't going to hurt himself, just needed to not feel anything for a while. Against my better judgment, I made the sale. Marcus began implementing what he calls harm reduction strategies in his dealings with Layne. I started cutting his product more than usual, diluting it so it would be less likely to kill him. Marcus explains. I also started giving him clean needles without charge and information about overdose prevention. It wasn't much, but it was all I could do within the context of our relationship. Throughout the mid-1990s, Marcus witnessed several intervention attempts by Layne's friends and family. These encounters gave him a unique perspective on the challenges of helping someone who doesn't want to be helped. Jerry Cantrell showed up at one of our meetings once, Marcus recalls. This was probably 1995 or 96. He'd followed Layne without Layne knowing. Jerry came up to me after the transaction and begged me to stop selling to his friend. Marcus's response to Jerry illustrates the complex moral calculus that drug dealers navigate. I told Jerry that if I stopped selling to Layne, he'd just find another dealer, probably someone less careful, someone who might sell him something that would kill him immediately, Marcus explains. At least with me, I knew what I was giving him. I knew how to keep him alive. Jerry's response stayed with Marcus for years. He looked at me and said, "So, you're telling me you're keeping him alive so you can keep killing him slowly?" That hit me hard, because it was true, Marcus admits. Marcus also encountered Layne's mother during this period, an experience he describes as heartbreaking. She found out somehow that I was his supplier and called me, Marcus remembers. This poor woman was crying, begging me to stop selling to her son. She offered to pay me whatever I would have made from Layne's purchases if I would just cut him off. Marcus was tempted to take the deal, but ultimately decided against it. I knew Layne would just find another supplier, and his mother's money wouldn't last forever, Marcus explains. Plus, if I took money to not sell to someone, word would get out and my business would be over. Other dealers would move in, and I'd have no way to protect any of my customers. As the 1990s progressed into the 2000s, Marcus watched Layne's condition deteriorate to the point where he barely resembled the person who had nervously approached him in that Capitol Hill parking garage. By 2000, Layne looked like a walking skeleton, Marcus says. He'd lost probably 60 pounds from his healthy weight. His teeth were falling out, his skin was grey, but the worst part was his eyes. They were completely dead, like looking at a corpse that was still technically breathing. Layne's behavior during transactions became increasingly erratic and concerning. He'd show up paranoid, convinced people were following him or watching him, Marcus recalls. He'd make me change meeting locations at the last minute, sometimes multiple times. He'd count and recount his money obsessively. Classic signs of drug-induced psychosis. Marcus also noticed that Layne had stopped talking about music entirely. In the early days, he'd sometimes mention Alice in Chains, talk about songs they were working on or shows they'd played, Marcus remembers. By 2000, he never mentioned music at all. It was like that part of his life had been completely erased by the addiction. The isolation was perhaps the most troubling aspect of Layne's decline. He told me once that he hadn't spoken to another human being in 3 weeks besides me and the people who delivered food to his apartment, Marcus recalls. He said he was afraid to see people he used to know because he didn't want them to see what he'd become. By early 2002, Marcus had made a decision that would have seemed impossible during his earlier years as a dealer. He was getting out of the business. At 36, he had saved enough money to start legitimate work and was tired of the toll his profession was taking on his conscience. I'd watched too many people die, Marcus explains. I'd attended too many funerals of customers who'd become friends. I couldn't keep telling myself I was just providing a service people were going to get anyway. But before he could exit the drug trade entirely, he had to decide what to do about his remaining regular customers, including Layne Staley. Layne was calling me almost every day by then, Marcus says. His tolerance was so high that he needed to use multiple times per day just to function. I knew that if I suddenly stopped selling to him without warning, he could die from withdrawal. Marcus began what he calls a managed transition, gradually reducing the potency and quantity of drugs he sold to Layne, while connecting him with resources for getting clean. I gave him phone numbers for treatment centers, told him about detox programs, even offered to drive him to rehab myself, Marcus recalls. But Layne wasn't interested. He said he was too far gone, that it was too late for him. In February 2002, Marcus made a decision that would define his relationship with Layne's memory for the rest of his life. I decided that my last month in business would be March, Marcus says. After that, I was done forever. I told Layne about this timeline and urged him one more time to get help. Layne's response was chilling. He said, "Don't worry about me, Street. After you're gone, I won't need anyone else." I didn't understand what he meant at the time, but looking back, I think he was already planning to end things. The day started when Marcus's phone rang at 7:23 a.m. It was Layne, but he sounded different, not desperate like usual, resigned. He said he needed to see me right away. They met at their usual spot, a Georgetown parking lot. Layne was 20 minutes late. When he showed up, I barely recognized him. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in 2 weeks since I'd last seen him. Layne got into Marcus's car, unusual for their typical window transactions. He wanted to talk. That was the first red flag. Layne hadn't wanted conversation during transactions in years. What Layne said next changed everything. He looked at me and said, "Street, I need you to sell me enough to make sure I don't wake up tomorrow." Just like that, direct. He was asking me to sell him a lethal dose. Marcus's response was immediate. I said no. Not just no to that amount, but no to any sale at all. For 45 minutes, they sat in that parking lot having a life-defining conversation. Layne started offering more money, first double, then triple, then all his cash, but probably $2,000. When I kept saying no, he got angry, then started crying. Marcus tried convincing Layne to seek help instead. I told him about a detox center that would take him immediately. I offered to drive him there, pay for treatment, but he shook his head and said it was too late. Layne kept insisting he'd get drugs elsewhere if Marcus wouldn't sell them. I told him I was done selling to him forever. If he wanted to kill himself, he'd have to find another way because I wouldn't provide the means. Layne's response revealed his despair. "You don't understand, Street. I'm already dead. I died years ago. I'm just asking you to make it official. Kurt's been waiting for me for 8 years. Marcus realized this was about more than drugs. It was grief and guilt over Kurt's death. Layne blamed himself for Kurt's death. He thought if he'd been a better friend, Kurt would still be alive. He was carrying that guilt on top of everything else. After nearly an hour, Layne accepted Marcus wouldn't sell him the drugs. He got quiet, looking out the window. Then he said something I'll never forget. "Thank you for not helping me do this, Street. You're a better person than I am." Before leaving, Layne had a final request. He asked me to promise that when people asked about him, I would tell them he wasn't a bad person. Tell them I was just sick and couldn't find a way to get better. Marcus made that promise, then asked Layne to wait at least a week before doing anything drastic. He said he'd think about it, but I could tell he was just telling me what I wanted to hear. He got out, drove away. I sat there another hour, wondering if I'd done the right thing or made a terrible mistake. That was the last time Marcus saw Layne alive. 3 weeks later, Marcus heard that Layne's body had been discovered. Death estimated April 5th, exactly 8 years after Kurt's suicide. I wasn't surprised, but I was devastated. I kept wondering if there was something else I could have said that might have changed his mind. Marcus attended the funeral from the back. I felt like I didn't belong there. I was the drug dealer, but I needed to pay my respects. The guilt was complex. Part of me wondered if I should have just sold him what he wanted that last day, but by refusing, I at least didn't have his death directly on my hands. Chapter 11. The Redemption. Following Layne's death, Marcus completely rebuilt his life. Using money saved from dealing, he earned a social work degree. I decided if I'd spent 10 years helping destroy lives, I should spend the rest trying to save them. For 18 years, Marcus has worked as a substance abuse counselor. When I talk to clients about addiction, they know I understand. I've been on both sides. I've enabled it and fought it. Marcus has helped hundreds get clean, seeing each success as balancing the scales. I can't bring back people who died from drugs I sold them, but I can try preventing others from dying the same way. Today, Marcus works at a South Seattle treatment center. His office displays a photo of Layne performing with Alice in Chains during their early years. People ask why I keep that picture. It reminds me of who Layne was before addiction took over, an artist who brought beauty into the world. The drugs didn't make him better. They eventually made it impossible for him to be an artist at all. Marcus's decision to speak publicly honors his promise to Layne. I promised I'd tell people he wasn't bad, just sick. But I also want people to understand addiction can be treated. Layne didn't believe recovery was possible, but it is. I've seen it hundreds of times. Marcus wants people to take hope from his story. If you're struggling, please don't give up. I know it feels impossible, like you're too far gone, but you're not. Recovery is always possible as long as you're breathing. For Marcus, the day he refused to sell drugs to Layne was both ending and beginning. The end of dealing and the start of healing. 21 years later, that refusal remains the decision I'm most proud of. Not because it saved Layne. It didn't. But because it saved me, and through me, hundreds of others. In the end, sometimes saying no is the most profound act of love possible.